Welcome to a discussion about the microeconomic basics of demand, supply, and the market equilibrium. This discussion is a basic foundation or possibly is a quick review if you have taken a course in microeconomics. When you have completed your study of this lecture, you will be able to 1. Define market demand, and describe what causes a shift along the demand curve, and what causes the demand curve to shift. 2. Define market supply, and describe what causes a shift along the supply curve, and what causes the supply curve to shift. 3. Explain how demand and supply determine the equilibrium for price and quantity. 4. Describe the concept of a production function. 5. Explain the measurement of demand and supply elasticity. As a tidbit of economic history, the early economists were philosophers, and the early moniker for the subject was political economy. There was no distinction between microeconomics and macroeconomics. Indeed, economics was only just coming into its own in the late 1700s and into the 1800s. The demand and supply framework was still evolving when John Stuart Mill originally published his book, Principles of Political Economy, in 1848. It was republished and updated 7 times during Mill's lifetime. The last update was in 1871. Mill was a British philosopher and political economist who lived between 1806 and 1873. Although this concept of supply and demand evolved further with work by Alfred Marshall, who is often considered the father of microeconomics, Mill stated the essence of the demand and supply model, as shown on this slide. Mill said that the term demand means the quantity demanded, and that there is a point where demand and supply equalizes. At a high level, that is still the essence of the demand and supply model. Okay, so let's look at the typical demand curve for a firm. Notice immediately it is presented as a downward directed line, moving from left to right. Also, notice that the convention is to put price on the y-axis, which is the vertical axis. The quantity demanded is put on the x-axis, which is horizontal. This demand curve, which shows combinations of price and quantity demanded, at given prices, is drawn here as a straight line for convenience. Alternatively, the demand curve may be nonlinear, that is, have a curved relationship, but it will still incorporate the inverse relationship between price and quantity. If it is curved, the demand relationship between price and quantity typically would be bellied inward from left to right. The main characteristics of demand are: demand represents the buyer's willingness and ability to purchase. Downward sloping from left to right. A price increase causes less quantity to be demanded. A price decrease causes more quantity to be demanded. It is governed by the law of demand, which incorporates all of the above characteristics. A change in price will cause a movement along the demand curve. So, the core thought about movement along this demand curve is that only a change in price will cause buyers to demand more or less, depending on whether that price change is downward or upward. But what if something other than price changes, say, income? Any changes to demand factors, other than price, will cause a shift in the demand curve. This is demonstrated, in the graphic, for a shift in average income from $35,000 to $50,000. For this product, the demand curve will shift to the right, as shown in the graphic. So let's summarize the key factors about a shift in the demand curve. Reasons that the demand shifts are: any changes in factors, other than the price of the product itself, will shift the demand curve. Those factors that will shift demand include changes in income, changes in preferences, expected changes in price and income, and availability of credit. A shift to the right in demand is an increase. A shift to the left is a decrease in demand. This is straightforward, right? Now, let's turn our attention to the supply curve. The domestic supply curve is determined by domestic production, plus product imports, less any exports. Notice immediately that supply is presented as an upward directed line, moving from left to right. This is so because production will increase as the product price goes up, and vice versa. This means that the market price and the quantity supplied of the product has a positive or direct relationship. That is, the price and quantity supplied move in the same direction. The key characteristics of supply are: supply represents the seller's willingness and ability to produce. Upward sloping from left to right. A price increase causes more quantity to be supplied. A price decrease causes less quantity to be supplied. Governed by the law of supply, which incorporates all of the above characteristics. A change in price will cause a movement along the supply curve. The same thing holds for the supply curve, as previously discussed for the shape of the demand curve. Although it is demonstrated here in this graphic as a straight line, it may be nonlinear. Also, movement along the supply curve is solely determined by any changes in the product price alone. In a similar manner, a shift in the supply curve comes about due to a change in factors other than the product's own price. Consider the example on the slide. The production cost of a pound of coffee jumps from $3 to $6, which causes the producers to reduce output, that is, supply. Obviously, this would work in reverse too. The key reasons supply curves will shift are: any changes in factors, other than the price of the product itself, will shift the supply curve. Those factors that will shift supply include changes in input prices, productivity, prices of substitutes and complements. A shift to the right in supply is an increase. A shift to the left is a decrease in supply. Please notice, the similarities in demand and supply shifts are both caused by factors other than the product's own market price. But if these other factors do not change, it is akin to a snapshot in time holding all of those other factors steady. But when those other factors change, this will cause a shift in either the demand or supply curves. Alfred Marshall, who is credited as the father of microeconomics, famously used a metaphor of a pair of scissors to think about supply and demand. Marshall wrote, quote, "We might argue whether it is the upper or the under blade of a pair of scissors that cuts a piece of paper, as whether value is governed by utility or cost of production. It is true that when one blade is held still and the cutting is affected by moving the other, we may say with careless brevity that the cutting is done by the second, but the statement is not strictly accurate, and is to be excused only so long as it claims to be merely a popular, and not a strictly scientific account of what happens." Unquote. So as this scissor metaphor suggests, supply and demand are intertwined to determine an equilibrium for price and output. Let's return to the coffee market example, and put the supply and demand curves together, much as Marshall's proverbial scissors, to the extent that buyers and sellers are both making decisions about the price and quantity, then the market price and market quantity is, so to speak, a consensus decision. That consensus on price and quantity from the buyer and seller sides occurs at the intersection of the buyer's demand curve and the seller's supply curve, and represents the market equilibrium. So the market equilibrium is a combination of a market price and a quantity that occurs when demand and supply are equal. But initially, in finding that equilibrium, demand and supply may not be in balance. When demand exceeds supply, this is termed excess demand. And when supply exceeds demand, this is termed excess supply. However, in a relatively competitive market, that market disequilibrium will exist for only a relatively short period, and market forces will move the demand and supply to a balancing point, which is the equilibrium shown in the graphic. With this discussion, We have sketched out the key basic characteristics of the supply and demand model. Obviously, I don't expect you to know all the nuances of the microeconomics supply and demand model, which is not the purpose of this discussion, but you should be clear on how it works. There are two other concepts that we need to cover briefly as foundations for our macroeconomic discussions ahead. The first of the last two topics that we will discuss is the production function. This concept is pretty much the same for the firm as for the aggregate economy, except for the fact that the aggregate economy includes a broader array of capital, labor, natural resources, and technology. The basic production function or relationship states that output is dependent on the capital and labor inputs. This is shown in the upper left-hand side of the slide. But a more elaborate and comprehensive production function includes natural resources and technology, which is shown in the lower left-hand corner of the slide. Since technology, we will see, is a key ingredient for output, this more comprehensive formulation has advantages, especially when focusing on long-term growth prospects for the economy. The key characteristics of the production function are: 1. It maps or relates production inputs to the production output, which is supply. 2. Typical production inputs are capital and labor. 3. This relationship is used to measure productive efficiency. 4. In the short run, some factors of production are assumed fixed, such as natural resources and technology. 5. In the long run, all factors of production are assumed variable. We shall see later that this production concept underlies the GDP statistic. Finally, another microeconomics concept that will be used in macroeconomics is the elasticity measure. This Alfred Marshall concept simply measures the percentage change in either demand or supply, divided by the percentage change in the price. Percentage change is measured from left to right, which means the ratio or the price elasticity measure of demand will be negative, because the demand curve is downward sloping. Or, another way of thinking about it is that price and output are inversely related. On the other hand, the price elasticity measure of supply will be positive, since the supply curve is upward sloping. However, interpretation of these measures is typically done in terms of the absolute value of the ratio, that is, the number without reference to the sign. The key characteristics of elasticity are: price elasticity is a measure of the extent to which the quantity demanded or supplied of a product changes when the price of that product changes. If the absolute value of price elasticity is greater than 1, demand or supply is elastic. If the absolute value of price elasticity of demand or supply equals 1, it is unit elastic. If the absolute value of price elasticity of demand or supply is less than 1, it is inelastic. The degree of elasticity is a measure of how sensitive the percentage change in output is to the change in prices. The more inelastic, the less sensitive; the more elastic, which is a ratio over the value of 1.0, then greater sensitivity. This concept, we shall see, when we discuss aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Before moving past the elasticity concept, it might be useful to briefly highlight a key takeaway about the elasticity characteristic of either demand or supply. It was already noted that the more inelastic demand or supply is, the less sensitive price change is to changes in output. This is shown here on this slide. So, what do you see here? Well, you should note that a perfectly elastic demand curve will produce no change in price, while a perfectly inelastic demand curve produces an unlimited change in price. Of course, those are the extreme cases and not always very realistic. A similar result can be seen when the supply curve is perfectly elastic or perfectly inelastic. Can you think of a recent case where supply might have been relatively inelastic, and there was considerable price pass-through from the producer to the consumer? How about during the COVID-19 pandemic? While we will not say much more on this point now, we will return to that topic later when we explore business cycles. For now, recognize that some of these simple insights can offer profound insights about how the aggregate economy operates. These microeconomic concepts of the firm do show up in macroeconomics, with some modification for the aggregate economy, which is why this review or introduction to these concepts is useful before launching into macroeconomics. This concludes this lecture.